welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I am your host, Jen, and today I am joined by an extremely accomplished writer and teacher. And I am so excited to discuss both those things in the context of a fantastic new novel, which by the time you are hearing this will be out in the world. And so it's my great joy to welcome to you our guest. Welcome. Could I ask you to give us your name and the name of your book, please?
Absolutely. Hi, and thank you for having me. My name is Cynthia Weiner, and the book is called A Gorgeous Excitement.
Thank you so much for sharing it with me and for coming by to talk about it. It's really, really strikingly wonderful. Like I had such a good time reading it. And, I spent a lot of my early 20s in the city. And so even though it was sort of at a different time period, it felt so resonant with being like young in Manhattan. And I'm so excited to discuss that and the context of the time period it is set in. But before we get to the book itself, could you tell us a little bit about your career and your journey to the book? I'd love to hear a little bit more about your advent to writing and your experience as a teacher of writing.
Sure. Well, I've been writing since I was very young, and I started teach. I got an MFA many years ago, and then I started teaching writing right after graduate school, teaching literature, teaching composition, teaching creative writing. So I've always been a huge reader. My parents were big readers, and we talked about words a lot and language, and went to a lot of plays and had dictionaries everywhere and all that kind of thing. So I've been writing for a long time, and I was writing short stories for many years. This novel is about an incident that took place in 1986. So I've tried to write it before as a story throughout the years, and it just didn't work. I tried to write it from various points of view and from various different time periods. It was one of those stories that's obviously stayed with me. And it was one of those stories that just became bigger and bigger as I was writing it. So I spent about the last, let's say, 9 years working on the novel. And yeah, so that's what I've been doing as a writer. And as a writing teacher, I teach at a place called the Writers Studio in New York City. It's also online. And our focus is the persona narrator in a story or a novel. I don't know if I'm getting too granular here.
Not at all. I love it.
A little or poem, meaning who tells the story. Is it first person? Is it third person? Is it a narrator looking back in time to maybe their own childhood, or is it a narrator who's right in the middle of the action? Are they telling their own story? Are they telling somebody else's story? Are they funny? Are they not, etc.? And so I was a student at the school for years also, and tried out the various narrators, and it's a very helpful technique for figuring out how to tell a story and kind of your own distance on that story, particularly if it happened to you.
That's fascinating and, very apt because it's something that this book does so well. Like I really loved spending time not only with Nina, but in her head. She's such an interesting character and she's so complex and more than a little messy, but like really, really, it's so easy to identify with her and sort of her the age at which she's at and her vulnerability. So could you talk a little bit maybe about shaping her as a character and shaping, the setting and how she kind of fits into it in time and place? Because it's so evocative of a really particular moment in sort of like recent New York history with a really strong sense of place. So I know that's huge. I've just thrown like a whole bunch of stuff at you, but
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the book takes place in 1986, and I was about her age in 1986, so I remember that time well. It's funny, when I first wrote her, I was a little bit more trying to be a little bit more correct, maybe. I'm not sure how else to say it. I was nervous about letting her be as messy as you said, which is such a great word, as vulnerable, and honestly as angry, as irritable, as funny as she is, because the circumstances that she's in, of course, the killing happens at the end of the summer, so she doesn't know what's going to happen yet, but she has a very volatile, depressed mother, and in sort of initial writings, I was more aware kind of from the adult point of view of the mother is ill and it's not her fault, and sort of trying to portray that. But the closer I got to Nina, the more I realized that though she knows those things, she's also, it's hard, it's hard. It's really hard. It's really terrible. Sometimes it's really angering when a mother is ill. Sometimes it's funny in strange ways when she says something weird or acts strange. All the different emotions come up. And so once I kind of allowed myself to let Nina be her full self, I think that was really helpful for shaping her character. And then another thing that happened was Nina is Jewish in the 80s in a very waspy Upper East Side of Manhattan society, and as was I. And I sort of elided that a little bit in first writing the book. I almost didn't want to deal with it. I hadn't wanted to deal with it when I was younger. I was a bit of an outsider, and I didn't love my name, and I didn't love being very pale and dark haired in this world of very, beautiful blue-eyed blondes and well, had country houses and knew each other forever, all those things. And when the book first went out to editors, the editor who ultimately bought it and really liked it mentioned something about that, about her Jewishness. And so that was really, and then I went home for 6 more months and worked on it longer. So that was a really big part of it too, that something I had almost involuntarily, maybe a little voluntarily wanted to submerge was something that really had to come more to the surface. And I'm so grateful because I think it makes it a better book. But it really meant stepping at Nina's vulnerability even more than I originally wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives her like a really strong urge to fit in and to be included. And it made me think a lot about like what inclusion means, because the people that she wants to be included among are not exactly like really nice to her. They certainly don't make her feel like she fully belongs, yet that the urgency to belong despite that really it makes her complexity make sense in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't want to go into this too much, but when Jews in America, in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s were, or 70s or 80s, and were not very, at least a large part, accepted and celebrated, maybe in certain cultures at least. And there was a lot of shame, sadly, and a lot of wanting to assimilate and wanting to be part of this other world and maybe leave part of the other world, which didn't feel as great behind. I mean, I'm speaking of my ancestors, not so much me, but and I don't want to speak for them, but you know what I mean? I think that did happen a lot, at least in New York. And so there was this sort of aspiration. My parents sent me to, it was a wonderful school academically, but it was, we said prayers, Christian prayers 3 times a week and Bible verses. And, there was 3 Jewish girls in my class. And it wasn't that they didn't want to be Jewish. I went to Hebrew school and I was bat mitzvah, but there was some sense that this is the world we want to belong to. And so I think that that's what Nina is facing also. This is the better, wealthier, more powerful world also at that time.
Mhm. Yeah, and it really, I think, speaks to how complex, like, you know, it's not just really about religion or culture, but about class
Yes.
too, and ethnicity, and all of these different things that intersect. It's just like a really, I think, really like beautifully complex portrait of what it means to want to fit in somewhere and the things that you will do so. So, could we talk a little bit more about the setting in the 80s on the Upper East Side? I had to read a little bit about the preppy murder of 1986 in preparation for this. I hadn't known about it, and it was really fascinating and tragic, obviously, and like gave me a lot to think about when reading this book. And I'm curious, like, what for you was the inception point? Was it that event or was it the character? Like, where did it sort of like, what was the seed?
Um, well, so the murder was a big deal for a number of reasons at the time. So it happened in August of 1986. It was 2 young, extremely good-looking people, girl and boy. It was a murder in Central Park. I'm not legally to say murder. It was a strangulation in Central Park. I'm not sure exactly what he was charged with, but And then he claimed that it was rough sex. She was hurting him. He had to get her off of him. And that it was an accident. So that was one of the big deals. And then another was how the media, shamed her and slut shamed her and certainly his lawyer, and that she had a sex diary, which turned out to be just basically a date book, and that she was aggressive and she was this and she was that. And Robert Chambers said she was, pushy and all sorts of things like that. So the murder was a big deal in New York. There was also underage drinking. They'd been there was a lot of things. Where were the parents, etc. I happened to know him, and he was he went to many different schools, and he was close friends with a friend of mine from one of those schools. And so I was at the bar where in real life they left from at the end of August and spent a lot of time at he and the girl. It's called Dorian's. And I was there a lot with them, and I didn't know her, but I did know him. I mean, not hugely well, but I knew him enough. So that was the original seed. As I have 4 nieces, and 2 of them are in college right now. And as they got older and seeing them navigate the same things that had been going on all those years before, that was definitely part of wanting to write this. Once I realized that the mother and certain struggles I had with my own parents back then, once I realized that those were, and actually literally happened the same summer, and that those kind of fit together, that also made me realize that the story was about a kind of exhilaration. And once I understood what the story was about, how Nina and how I had so desperately wanted to feel free and to feel unself-conscious, and how one tries to do that, and that she thinks that's what's happening. To me, it felt like an interesting story, that she thinks doing cocaine, and that this guy and her mother's, mania, which she thinks is just her feeling better. Once, all that exhilaration that builds over the course of the summer, really, to be able to lay out the darker side of that was interesting. So I think that all of those kind of came together at different points, but coalesced. At the same time, my nieces are growing older too, are still in college, and facing we're facing, certain things in this world that are somewhat similar to the 80s. And all of those together made me, no, I forgot your question. I'm sorry. I hope that answered.
Absolutely did. Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about, um that murder in 1986 and sort of like its impact on like not even only like culture but like our media, like I was so reminded of like Laura Palmer from Twin Peaks, and down to the details of like a diary, and like it's like that sort of like I don't know, that figure has, I think, like featured very prominently like in a lot of our storytelling. And it's such a really like empathetic and really like, you know, holding her to a light and, showing her in all of her complexity and messiness, but also like with a lot of love for her, which I really, really appreciated. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad that came across. I feel a lot of care for that girl, for all the girls in the story, honestly. Yeah, whether they're obnoxious, whether they're sometimes badly behaved, it doesn't matter. Nobody deserves, of course, what winds up happening to the girl at the end of the book. And this idea of girls being painted as, too aggressive or too pushy, that was something I dealt with a lot when I was young. I wasn't even that pushy, but it doesn't matter. That's sort of when boys get nervous and, women are out at work too much. And so, yeah, I'm glad that came across my concern.
Yeah. And that really gets at like sort of the lose-lose situation that Nina finds herself in. Because so I hope you don't mind me mentioning, but like the part of the story where she is sort of like bent on losing her virginity this summer. Um it's like it's like gosh, I don't want to say cute because that's really condescending and also not accurate, but it's like really it reminds me of just being that age and wanting like desiring really intensely and also wanting to be desired and how complex that is and how those things can feel the same, you know? So I'd love to know more about like how, that sort of like double bind that Nina finds herself in because she's supposed to want to lose her virginity, but also like that is something that like women are shamed with all the time, like for, fulfilling your expectations in society. And then also, like it's all really complex and there's no winning in that situation. So can you talk about maybe Nina in relation to that and the space of the bar, Flanagan's, which I believe you said is based on Dorian's, right?
Interesting. It's interesting to think about. I don't know that I've ever even thought about she's desperate to lose her virginity, and yet there's all and the idea of girls being sexy was such a considered a wonderful thing, and yet it's a terrible thing. You're right. It's really interesting. I don't even know if she wants to have sex, and honestly, in all honesty, I think it's more like it just that feeling of like, as you said, to want to be desired and to feel if I'm pretty, I'm okay. If I'm desired, I'm okay. If I'm, that means something, and that's currency in this world. But yeah, that can lead to, there's a sort of it's both sexy, but as you said, promiscuous. And I think of the music, and I've been writing a playlist about for the book, and just thinking of the music at that time, and of Madonna, and of this idea of being, she was so cool and sexy, and yet she was so shamed at the same time. Both happening. The Madonna who are both happening at the same time. It's interesting. And in terms of the bar, in real life, and I'm not sure Dorian's loves being reminded of this, but at the time there were many, they had the owners had several children who I think had gone to several New York schools, and knew a lot of people. So the bar was this very popular bar. Everybody went there. Everyone went there during the summer. I think people still go there now, as far as I can tell. A lot of people, a lot of young people. At that time, the drinking age had just changed from 18 to 21, so it was still a little bit murky. People could get in with fake IDs or probably no IDs. So I think the bar is almost a familial place in a way. When I was younger, my parents were out all the time. There were no cell phones, obviously. There was no social media. There was no, geo tags or whatever they're called on a phone, because there were no phones. So, nobody knew where their kids were. The kids said, I'm going to somebody's house, and you just assumed they did. So the bar, everybody goes to the bar, but in a way that becomes almost like somebody's house. It's sort of it feels like a safe place. I'm sure that in real life, the girl who was killed felt safe there. Robert Chambers, I think, went there all the time, constantly, because I think the owners were like parents to him. And I think a lot of people felt that way. So there was something about that bar in particular that I think had that feeling to it. When people didn't even get along with their parents, maybe, or barely saw them, the parents, or certainly the father figure, in real life, was always there at the bar and friendly and talking with kids and sometimes counseling them, from what I've heard. So yeah, I don't know, again, any of that still goes on. I have no idea. It's 40 years later, but at the time, I'm pretty sure that was part of it.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and that fits in so well with like what Nina is after in this book because I think like, consciously for her it's about sex, but it's also like it's about aspiration and like wanting to be a part of a certain group of people and a certain class, lifestyle perhaps, and validation, like she's seeking that sort of affirmation of herself and that she's wanted and, desirable. Can you talk a little bit about that in relation to Gardner Reed? Because I sort of like I think it's really fascinating how he like represents all of that, not just like, a super handsome guy who everybody is sort of competing for, but the sort of like the image almost of like that, the kind of belonging that she is after.
Well, the way I wanted to portray him, and I'm not sure if he was like this in real, although maybe he was like this in real life, is he doesn't care. He's a legend. I sort of tried to put that at the beginning of the book. Everybody talks about his exploits, that he, stole a fur coat from a check room and gave it to a homeless woman on the street, which is insane. I mean, no one, I don't think anyone ever does that. But, that sort of idea of him as this Robin Hood, or he's this special person, and he drove a principal's, headmaster's car into the pool. I'm not even sure if I kept all these details, but this is how I was originally thinking. So, and he's on it was a very big deal when I was young to be on a committee of a charity event. That was just considered the great. So they used to have, a junior committee, and it would be kids who were still in high school, but everyone would get the invitations, and there were the names of those sort of anointed people. And so for the Gold and Silver Ball or for some other charity events, and I tried to make it that he was part of that also in real life and in the real life of the book. Gardner is not from that kind of a family. He's not from that kind of a background. And in fact, doesn't really half wants and half doesn't want to be part of it. Is very ambivalent. But Nina doesn't see that, as in real life. I don't think most people did see that. She sees, the sort of movie star quality as somebody who is the ultimate in belonging. Everybody wants to sit at his table, and everybody wants to, to be paid attention to by him. And so to be paid attention to by him seems the greatest thing in the world to happen. Like this, you're suddenly, where did this come from? Oh my God, like, look how special I am. So that's a lot of it. I mean, and again, in real life, this is one of the reasons I was so fascinated by this case, is that this is truly true. You can think of, wherever you went to high school or college or your town, that guy or maybe there was a couple of them that everybody knew. He was handsome and he was cool and he was nice and he was, maybe a little aloof, but everybody, I've heard stories about Robert Chambers that girls followed him down the street. Girls waited on his stoop for him to come home from school. I mean, he was really one of those charismatic people. Mm-hmm. And for him, of all people, to kill somebody, it was crazy. It was outrageous. It was incomprehensible. So I think, again, that's one of the reasons this case was such a big deal. And certainly for me was, it wasn't just some ordinary guy. I don't even know what I mean by that, but it wasn't sort of the guy around, the guy next door, the guy you didn't really notice. It was the guy doing it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like she, she wants him, but also like is covetous of like just the way he moves through the world, like the way that any man moves through the world knowing that it was made for him, like that sort of confidence that it engenders and the aloofness. And just the way that plays into, how like the media takes these stories and then creates messages or morals or, images of people that may not like relate to the reality of it at all.
To tell you quickly, if you go to look at New York Magazine, I wish I had the cover from 1986 when this took place. The cover of the magazine was a huge picture of him in like a tie and a jacket, looking very handsome, and a teeny little picture of her in the corner. And that was how, that was how they wrote the whole story about the killing. But that was the cover.
And that is like something that you see constantly, I think, repeated over and over again in the decades that have happened since then, is that like, not to put too fine a point on it, but that like young women's reputations are sacrificed even after they are victimized in order to preserve like the future of a promising young man or
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I kept thinking things have changed so much. They changed so much. Hadn't they changed so much in all these years? And I don't know. It doesn't seem that. It's human nature in a lot of ways, I guess.
Yeah, it gave me so much to think about and really so much really to relate to. Like you mentioned college before. I was a college student at NYU like from 2001 to 2005. And even though it's like a little bit of time later and that New York was a very different city at that point, like some of the depictions of just like being young in New York City felt so resonant still. Like I also used to walk around the city after midnight. Like it was a Discman, not a Walkman, but like it was such a I was even also listening to the Talking Heads,
Oh.
Yeah, and I just like it felt like so relatable and it just was like a really, I don't know, I really enjoyed the book so much and thank you for sharing it with me and for coming by to talk about it. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you so much. Your questions were brilliant, and that was a really fun discussion. Thank you. It gave me a lot to think about, too. I so appreciate it.
All right, listeners, it's now your turn. Please check out A Gorgeous Excitement by Cynthia Weiner. It is absolutely beautiful. It is out in the world as of the time that you hear this. So head over to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for those things. All right, it's time to close this chapter. We'll see you.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.